Okay, let's start the first session. My name is Dmitry Yemanov. I'm a member of the Firebird Development team. And the first session is dedicated to what's new in the area of Firebird Development for this year. Well, I see many faces from the past year. And as you supposedly noticed, Firebird 3 has not been released yet. So there are no big announcements this year. But anyway, it doesn't mean that the Firebird core team did nothing this year. So a lot of activities happened and a lot of developments were happening. And this session is intended to outline what has been done, what you can see and test, what should you expect this year and the next year, and what state is Firebird 3 development at the moment. First of all, let's start with the Firebird Development maintenance program. Point releases that are released to fix known bugs and sometimes introduce some improvements. As you know, I believe everybody here follows the Firebird development and Firebird releases. So you should know that there were two point releases announced this year. First of all, it was Firebird 2.0.7 and another one in Firebird 2.1.5. The first one appeared in April, the second one in June. You may see how many bugs were fixed in several of these releases. And Firebird 2.1.5 introduced some improvements, just a couple of them, but anyway, they were quite significant. But the major thing is to announce here, and maybe just to repeat this announcement, that Firebird project has decided to announce end of life for the Firebird 2.0 series. It means that Firebird 2.0.7 was the final point release in that version series, and we will not be maintaining it anymore. The reason is simple. Our release policy that is available on our website clearly states that versions released longer than 5 years ago are declared dead and not supported anymore. Of course, you are free to use it. Continue using it. It's up to you. But we strongly recommend you to consider upgrade to any of the more recent versions. The technical reason behind this is that the code base has improved quite much since that for these years, and it's becoming more and more complex, harder and harder to backport all the bug fixes from recent versions back to the old versions. It takes a lot of our time, and of course, at the same time, many of you complaining for us not releasing Firebird 3 or any other new releases. So we just had to choose what our priorities are. So this is why old release, well, very old release means dead release. So just be aware about that. Of course, Firebird 2.1 and Firebird 2.5 series are still supported. Bug fixes will be released quite often, and if possible, they will include some improvements in the performance area, in the monitoring area, and so on. So this is just about two of the maintenance releases. But you know that Firebird 2.5 has already been released 2 years ago, and it's also in the point releases series. So where is the Firebird 2.5.2? Our roadmap was promising it to be released in the third quarter this year, but unfortunately it did not happen yet, although we are pretty close to release it. There were some issues in the testing area, and we still experience some problems with the Mac OS port. This is why it has been delayed a bit. But the primary platforms, Windows and Linux, are okay, so you should expect the announcement for at least these two platforms soon after the conference. Because the builds are ready, the KPass was okay, so we don't have any problems with these two platforms. So we hope it to be released a bit earlier, but it will happen maybe late October or probably early November. A lot of bugs were fixed in Firebird 2.5.2, but if you would compare number of bug fixes in Firebird 2.5.2 with number of bug fixes in Firebird 2.5.1, it's twice or thrice less. So it means that the code gets really stable, that a lot of testing pressure that we put on the first initial release and first sub-release has discovered maybe, well, we're all programmers and we know that it's impossible to find all the bugs, but the testing has showed a lot of problems that were addressed. So the code in this particular version is getting more and more stable. But still, I like to point you to a few important bug fixes. 10 bug fixes were related to server crashes. One case of index corruption was noticed and fixed. And there was one performance regression specifically in Firebird 2.5.1 related to massive inserts into some table when the performance was actually less than expected and less than the original Firebird 2.5 release. This issue has also been resolved. This point release introduced a few minor improvements in various areas, and I will show them in the next slide. What I would like to tell you, if you are running Firebird 2.5.0 or Firebird 2.5.1, please look carefully to the number of fixed crashes and corruptions and seriously consider an upgrade. This is important, you know. Production systems, well, index, any kind of corruption, even the index corruption, which is quite not that important as data corruption, because the index can be rebuilt and the problem could disappear. But still, it's a problem that should never happen on production databases. And of course, the heavily loaded server should never crash, because its downtime costs a lot for many of you. So please consider an upgrade. What improvements were added to the Firebird 2.5.0 release? Maybe the major one of them is the ability to perform backup and restore via the API, services API, but remotely. You perhaps know that backup and restore via services API was also always available, but it always worked in the local mode only. The backup was created on the server host, and the use restored from the server host to the server database. So it didn't support any remote interaction. You could ask, why is this important? Because we have a GBAC with excellent abilities to do remote backups. Correct, but GBAC, due to its architecture and how it works with data, is known to be very slow on networks, especially across the internet, high latency networks. This was the primary reason why we had implemented remote backup restore with the API. How it differs from the GBAC work, regular GBAC work via the network. The server performs the backup at the server side as usual, but data blocks of quite big size are being transmitted to the client via a separate channel. So it's not about record, but record transmitted. It's about a big block of the already created file. This is, well, our tests show that it's about 1 order of magnitude faster over slow networks. What else has been added to this sub-release? A bit of logging improvements. We had a tracker ticket that was asking us to log sweeping actions, when the sweeping starts, when the sweep ends. So it's now available. This information is now logged in firebird.log file. You could see not only start and finish events for the sweep, but also any kind of error if it happened during the sweep. And also you will see transaction counters. So next, all the snapshot, all this interesting, all the active counters before the sweep starts and after it finished. So you could really analyze, did it work well, and was it able to advance the transaction pointers, transaction counters, or not. It could not do it, for example, due to some problems with transactions and not being able to garbage collect. This is just about Firebird log file, but you know that Firebird 2.5 has a new tracing feature, and of course it would be nonsense to log the sweeping events only in Firebird log, but not trace it with a tracing feature. So again, all these kinds of events, transaction counters, are available via the tracing facility. Additionally, the trace will show you the performance of the sweep. What tables have been swept, how many records have been swept, garbage collected, how many reads were performed from the cache or from the disk during this process. And if we speak about garbage collection, this of course means that some pages will be written back to the database after modification. All this information is now available in the tracing feature. Also, well, it's controlled by the new parameter of the trace. It's named log sweep. And one more extension to the tracing facility is to log runtime errors thrown by the engine. So you could turn on the logging of any kind of errors and see how often, for example, constraint violations happen in your database, and any other kinds of runtime activities that usually only the client application will see. It was never available to the database administrator. Now it's possible to track these errors via the tracing facility as well. Also, I don't know whether any of you is aware of the problem that Firebird has with large databases very exceeding the available memory amount on the server on recent Windows versions. Specifically, it's Windows 2003, 2008, Windows 7. When the Firebird performance degraded significantly, especially after large database scans. For example, if you run backup and it scans the whole database, or for example, if you run sweep, it also reads the whole database. It just caused the file system cache to be polluted with pages of the database. And unfortunately, it caused some really big performance problems later when you start to execute regular queries, modifications, and so on. The database was terribly slow. We had it reported in the tracker and the support lists, and we didn't know what is the reason until recently. But finally we have discovered it was related to the flags that we use to open files on Windows. And so it seems that some internals on the Windows file cache has changed in recent Windows versions, and it started to interact with Firebird activity related to disk access and file system cache. We will manage to find a solution. It's not really a bug fix because it's not really a problem in Firebird, and of course we cannot fit bugs in Windows. But solution was found, and in a lot of cases, mainly 9 of 10 cases, it noticeably improved the performance. No any more lockups, no any more performance degradations, and so on. No any more slow response from Firebird. So if you run Firebird with really big databases under hard load, and if you use any recent Windows versions, this is mostly about 64-bit systems, both Windows and Firebird. Please consider and upgrade. It doesn't really mean that if you run in Firebird 2.1, you should upgrade to Firebird 2.5.0, because this or 2.5.2, because the solution has been backported, so it's available in all recent Firebird versions. So Firebird 2.1.5 already have it fixed as well. So beware about that. And again, if it's important for you, if you have noticed these problems in your production systems, please consider an upgrade. Well, now what happens with the Firebird 3 development? I'm proud to say that we are quite close to release an alpha. All the primary goals have been completed. There are a few remaining things that need some cleanup, some decisions, some finalizing, but it's a matter of maybe 1 or 2 months. So we could expect the alpha this year, provided that we will be able to complete all the documentation required for that. As you know, we don't usually release complete release notes for the alpha builds, but a lot of readmes must be available to you to test the new features properly. So we can say that the Firebird 3 alpha is mostly about some finalizing and documentation. So you could expect it soon. What are the remaining things? You could see we need some polishing of the new API, object-oriented. Then it will be posted for public discussion in our mailing lists. We had already we have added support for longer data streams. What I mean here, remove the limit of 64 kilobytes for SQL texts, BLR streams, messages delivered between the engine and the client library, parameters, input and output, maybe some internal buffers like the output, the row size, maximum row size of the stored procedure, the maximum row size of the sort buffer. So we have promised to remove the limits. The new API already have it supported. It doesn't have the limits, but the internal code parts still need some adjustments. Per database authentication is implemented and it works. You may now create users and authenticate your connections not against the security database, but against your working database. But there are some problems found related to the remote execute statement feature. For example, if you have successfully logged to a server, one of the changes in Firebird 3 is that the authentication is performed not by the engine, but by the remote server at the network level. So if you successfully connected to the server, you are connecting to the database, you are allowed to log in, everything is fine, and then you execute a remote statement against another database on the same server. If the connection is local, you will not pass through the authentication code on the remote server. But you don't know whether you are allowed to connect to another database or not. This is the issue we are resolving now. The solutions are possible. So just something that was not really obvious for many of you, but that struck us during the development. And we are adding some new permissions to the database. And specifically, we have introduced a usage permission that allows you to limit access to generators, exceptions, char sets, user-defined collations, and so on. This is done accordingly to the SQL specification. And of course, it requires some changes in the internal database format, new types of the ACL, access control lists, and so on. But it's also almost ready. There is nothing else to do for us to release alpha. So you can see how close we are. This situation is really different if we would look at the past year. So most of our efforts for this year was to finalize the missing parts and the primary goals and make it possible to release it sooner. Of course, everybody knows that the primary goal was the SMP-friendly super server with a shared page cache and fine-grained multi-threading, fine-grained synchronization. That has been completed, and maybe for a few months already you could test it in snapshot builds. But of course, we know that a lot of people will never try to test the server until it's alpha or beta or something like that. A lot of people are afraid of the snapshot builds. So this is yet another reason for us to release alpha sooner, just because to involve more of you to the testing. While the shared page cache is implemented and it works really good on the multi-core and multi-CPU systems, you know that the engine also has a metadata cache. It works the same way as in Classic. It's private to the particular attachment. For some cases, if you have, for example, not maybe big database, but very complex metadata in the database, a few hundred of tables, thousands of stored procedures, and highly nested calls of these procedures involving maybe some updates that are involving triggers and turn and so on. So the number of metadata involved in the simple query could be cascading. It would mean that the engine would try to cache all that metadata, and in such a complex databases, I mean complex from the metadata point of view, it could lead that the metadata cache occupies more memory than the shared page cache. Well, this is a known problem, but maybe only a few users have been experienced it at the level that could really prevent them to operate properly. Mostly it's just a matter of adding more memory to your server, but still it could be a problem for some of you. So we are considering various solutions how to decrease the memory used by the metadata cache. For example, clean up some of the unused objects that are not used for a quite time, and so on. It will be analyzed, investigated, and the solutions will be offered later. Also, since we are speaking about super server, it means that only one server process accessing the database. Nobody else is able to connect to the database. A number of optimizations are possible that are related to just synchronization that is easy to implement inside a single process that involving cross-process communication. Because you know that Firebird 3 does not have separate classic and super server builds. The build is single. You just set up the config file whether you want it to work in the super server mode and the classic mode. That means that the code base is the same for all the architectures. And of course, it means that any optimizations, any code paths that could be, some operations that could be avoided, for example, in super server mode, all these optimizations should be done dynamically based on the configuration. So they are possible, and they will be implemented as soon as we find any bottlenecks in this regard. And one more feature, new feature, that while you know that we had super server for a while it was not SMP friendly, but it had a shared page cache anyway. One new feature that is going to be added to the shared page cache, it's page prefetch. The engine could try to detect when it makes sense to read the pages in advance before the user connection actually accesses them. It means both asynchronous prefetch and synchronous prefetch. Synchronous prefetch could just read, for example, if you perform a full table scan, you don't have to read one page, then another page. You could read just a big data block from the file, and thus really reduce the disk input-output consumption. This work is still in progress. It's not a blocker for alpha, so you will see how it works in the next build, be it alpha 2 or most probably it will be beta 1. A number of the features that I expected in Firebird 3. Some of them are completed. For example, window functions. A lot of them you can find in the snapshot builds and test them. But actually, the SQL specification has a bit more of them that we have already implemented. So you could expect maybe the entire list added to Firebird just a bit later, not in alpha. Some extensions to the monitoring tables are going to be added. Some of them are already done. For example, you could see the version of the network protocol, the version of the client library of the attachment to detect whether it's outdated and doesn't need upgrading and so on. Some other information, host name instead of not only the IP address, but also the host name of the remote connection and the operating system username of the remote connection. Runtime statistics. Here I mean more performance counters available in the monitoring tables. Now we have input-output stats and record stats. All these kinds of information will be extended. More information will be available both at the page level and record level. And more information will be added completely new. I mean, sorting stuff, how many bytes were sorted and so on, how many operations was performed against the temporary files, and how good has it been cached, how many operations were performed in memory buffers, and how many operations had to go to disk due to swapping, and so on. The new feature will be timing statistics that will allow you to check how many times some attachment or some connection or some transaction is executed, statements, and so on. I was speaking about that the past year. You could find the slides from the past year conference and read more details about that. I'm not going to repeat it. As you know, the Redsoft Corporation had a kind of clone of the Firebird database using in their specific requirements, government-related, and we are communicating with them to have their improvements, some of them at least, to analyze by our team and to be merged in our code base. They're mostly related to security. Security for DDL operations and some other improvements. Some of them are standard, exist in the SQL specification, and some are specific. And yet another big chunk of work was related to the optimizer and new algorithms to access data. I'm not going to speak now about that because my next session is partially dedicated to exactly this area. And a few developments done yet outside the main code base. It means it's private development trees, some customer sponsored work that it has not been merged in the code base, and so on. You can see just the list of some of the features we are working on. I just see that my time is almost over for this session, but this is mostly everything I wanted to tell now. I think we will now have a kind of 2 or 3 minutes break before my next session, which will be dedicated to the optimizer, its evolution since the first Firebird version, and what solutions we are going to offer in the optimizer area in Firebird 3. So now if you have any questions about the roadmap, maintenance builds, Firebird 2.5, please ask now. If no, we'll continue in a couple of minutes. Yeah. Yes, I just did. I wasn't speaking about this now because it was explained quite in depth in the past year conference, and I didn't want to repeat everything from there. So of course, if you wasn't there, you just maybe not don't have that kind of information available. Firebird 3 introduces wire level encryption for the protocol, all kinds of communications, and Firebird 3 introduces database level encryption at the page level with the key that could be provided by either client application, for example, if you distribute some database along with your application, or maybe it could be provided by some server-side providers, security providers, and so on, if we speak about standalone server installation. So it's configurable, and multiple choices are possible to set it up properly. So both these features will be, well, not will be, they are already available in Firebird 3. You could test it in snapshot builds. We are just lacking some documentation in this area. Okay, let me drink a bit of water and we'll continue.